Hi boys and girls. Down below, click on the CC on your screen for closed captioning. That'll bring up the words so you can read along with me as I read the next chapter of I, Freddy. Chapter 6 of I, Freddy. Sophie! Yes, Mom? Bring me a glass of water, would you? It was lunchtime, and although our kind likes to sleep until nightfall, I left my burrow because Sophie had just come home from school and was going to feed me. And now Mom had butted in yet again from her bedroom. I don't know how she managed to hit on the crucial moments at such a long range. Some kind of mysterious telepathic powers, I guess. Right away, Mom! I'll just feed Freddy first. I'd have bet my entire hoard of food on what would come next. The creature can wait! Bingo. Plus a special bonus for predicting her exact words. I have to take my pills. Yes, Mom, said Sophie. She disappeared, leaving me empty-pawed. Okay, so it wasn't an absolute tragedy. I would get my food in due time, but I was still annoyed. For one thing, by Sophie's eternal, dutiful, yes, Moms. Okay. She naturally couldn't tell Mom to fetch her own glass of water, but in her place, I'd have talked back occasionally. Just a little, at least. But maybe I was looking at it the wrong way. Maybe Sophie enjoyed fetching Mom glasses of water, not to mention all the other things that was demanded of her. Because Mom made Sophie jump to it quite often. Sometimes she'd be sent to fetch an extra pillow, or an extra blanket, or a damp cloth for Mom's forehead, or a Walkman when Mom felt like some music during her migraines. I'm not saying Mom could have fetched all these things herself. She probably couldn't help getting her migraines in the afternoons. When Sophie was home, all this, I'm prepared to admit, was true. But one thing really was unnecessary, and that was my second source of annoyance. The fact that Mom always called Sophie just when she was feeding me. Here you are, Mom, Sophie says, far away in Mom's bedroom. Must have brought her the water, I guess. Thanks, I could hear Mom drinking. Then she said, You're always messing around with that animal when I call you. But I've got to feed him, said Sophie. Yes, I know, but remember this. Hamsters are solitary creatures. If they aren't left in peace, they get stressed. True, I thought. Thanks for the kind thought, Mom, except that it didn't apply to Sophie. Sophie looked after me and left me in peace, just like I needed. Anyway, why was this sudden concern for me on Mom's part? Then I grasped the truth. She wasn't worried about my well-being at all. It was about Sophie. Mom couldn't bear Sophie looking at me. And that was why she butted in whenever I was being fed. It came to me in a flash. Mom wanted Sophie all to herself. How ridiculous. Me, a tiny golden hamster, a rival for Sophie's affection? Was Mom really afraid I'd take her place? I mean, she wasn't a newborn hamster to be shoved aside by fellow competitors for their mother's milk. Clearly, something was going on inside her that our kind couldn't understand. Whatever it was, I felt as if I'd picked up an unfamiliar scent. Warning lights flashed in my brain. Mom was a potential danger. But what kind of danger? The possibility that she might insist on returning me to the pet shop had been banished for good. I reckon now that I was in such great shape and I couldn't think of anything else. At all times, I would have to be on my guard. I started to think up some precautions. Against the what? Because I didn't know. This promised to be a pretty futile occupation. Then Sophie came back. Mom had gotten what she had wanted, so now I could be fed. Sophie actually managed to give me my food without further interruption. Then she carried my cage over to the table, opened the little door, and I clambered out. I'd only just sat down beside the reader when a voice called in the distance. Sophie! Yes, Mom? She really had the patience of an angel, that girl. Careful, though. Maybe Mom was getting ready to strike the first blow against me. Bring me some tissues, would you? Maybe not. Yes, Mom. Sophie got up and walked to the door. She was actually going to leave the room, leave me sitting on the table all by myself. At last, I would be alone with the reader at last. Now I could leaf through the pages in peace and look for something more interesting to read. But then Sophie stopped, just short, and swung around. Returning to the table, she picked me up and put me back in my cage. The little door shut with a click. Then she left the room. Me, I sat slumped behind the bars, disappointed at the first, then more and more exasperated. I got really mad at Sophie. Out of my cage, in my cage, just as her ladyship pleased, as if I were an inanimate object. It didn't occur to her that an animal like me was a living creature whose wishes might extend to something more than an adequate diet and a clean cage. But if Mom so much as sighed, she came running. Humans be darned. Good riddance to the whole bunch of them. Independence was what I needed. Out of my cage, into my cage, yes, but just as I pleased. Why not? Why couldn't I open the cage door myself? That would certainly be a useful precaution against my future skullduggery on Mom's part. If danger threatened, I would simply vanish, leaving Mom high and dry. So there! I climbed up the door and inspected the fastener at the top. An absurdly simple mechanism. The bar above the door curved down in the center to form a flexible catch that snapped into place when the door was shut. To open it, all one had to do was climb up and apply outward pressure. It was positively primitive, but highly effective. Strain as I might, and no matter how hard I braced my nose against the catch, I wasn't strong enough to disengage it. I gave up, at least for the moment, and climbed down again. I had to do so in any case, because Sophie had come back into the room. She couldn't be allowed to suspect, not at this stage, that I was debating how to open the door of my cage. Exactly how time alone would tell. Here, Freddy! Something tasty for you! It was an extra ration of ground beef. Extra ration of ground beef. Sophie was one in a million. After all, and one who, compared to me, must possess the strength of an elephant. When she opened the cage door again, she simply disengaged the catch by pressing it down with her thumb. How could I ever manage that? Sophie! Yes, Mom? Have you seen my glasses anywhere? It was evening now. Sophie had put me back in the cage, and Mom seemed to be over her migraine for the day. Yes, Mom. They're on the sofa in the living room. Beside your book? Besides Mom's book? Did that mean Mom also had some books? But of course, why hadn't I thought of that? Of course Mom reads books whenever she didn't have a migraine. She didn't sit watching television, that I would have heard it anyways. She must have a hoard of reading matter someplace. Instead of hoping to find something readable on Sophie's desk someday, I had to figure out how to get to Mom's stack of books. That would solve my problems in a flash. My intellectual problems, I mean. The problem how to get the cage door open showed no signs of resolving itself, however. I would simply have to devise some method or other. Hard as I racked my brain, absolutely nothing occurred to me. In order to relax, and because it was the right time of night for it, I went jogging. The moment I climbed onto the carousel and the angled wooden disc revolved a little under my weight, at that very moment, I saw the light. I suddenly knew how to open the cage door, but only in principle, because I had to rack my brain some more before I figured out how to practice it. One thing was obvious. I needed a fairly long lever so that I could insert one end beneath the door catch. If I hung on to the other end with all my might, possibly increasing my weight by the addition of 2 well-filled cheek pouches, the catch would be bound to spring open. But where to find a suitable lever? That problem too I solved in less than a minute. In theory, that is to say, because in practice I was regrettably obliged to wait until the afternoon of the following day. To an enterprising golden hamster with great plans in mind, that seemed an awfully long time. I couldn't even use the delay to work out what I would do if I actually got the cage door open. Everything would depend on whether I could even reach the floor, and that was doubtful, because my cage usually stood on a shelf against the wall. Although the shelf was low, there was no way of climbing down as far as I could see, but only as far as I could see with my rather poor eyesight. The shelf seemed to be a long one. What awaited me on the other end? I just didn't know. I flitted nervously to and fro inside my cage like a swallow before a thunderstorm. The ensuing night tried my patience to the limit. But morning came around once more, then lunchtime, and then, at long last, the waiting was over. Sophie returned from school and fed me. Mom didn't even butt in this time, strangely enough. Soon, she would start on her homework. That meant she would put my cage on the table and I'd be able to solve my lever problem. But she didn't do any homework. She didn't stay in her room either. She spent the time elsewhere in the apartment. I could hear her walking around, restlessly somehow. Gregory was also on the move a lot. It seemed he was getting his things together, articles of clothing for the most part. Once I heard him ask Mom where his white tuxedo could have gone to, which she shot back that she wasn't his maid. Mom had been spared a migraine today, incidentally, but was also in the grip of some restless urge to move around herself. What the heck was going on? The commotion in the apartment persisted throughout the afternoon, and I simply couldn't make heads or tail of it. Then the doorbell rang. "Gregory, your taxi's here!" "Coming," Gregory called out. Then I heard him tell Sophie, "I'll try to call you every day, okay? I'll only be gone 2 weeks." Then I got it. Gregory was going away. Of course, he must be going on tour with the orchestra. And Sophie and I were staying behind on our own. On our own with Mom. Alright, that concludes our chapter for today. Check back next time for chapter 7. See you soon.